All right, welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're letting folks in now, so we'll get started with a little bit of an introduction as people join us today. I'm Allison Thompson with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and I'll be giving a brief introduction to today's webinar and some housekeeping before I hand it over to our speaker. For everyone's information, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available publicly on FAR's website after today's session. During the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in the webinar. After the presentation is over, we will have some open time for questions with myself, Tiffany, and a representative from PepsiCo, Andre Eitner. Our topic for today is the request for applications that was released last week titled Regenerative Agriculture for Climate Resilient Farms and Value Chains. This is an open opportunity under FAR's Ag Mission Program area on climate smart agriculture. Our partner PepsiCo is providing the matching funds for this solicitation, so applicants to the program will not need to identify their own matching funds. And our objective with this call is really to catalyze and accelerate climate adaptation and resilience in agriculture with a focus on exploring regenerative agricultural practices as climate adaptation practices. We anticipate that successful proposals will include both an implementation component where farmers are engaged directly in adopting relevant adaptation practices, as well as a research component that will be designed to further our understanding of the impact adopting those practices will have on a farm's economic and environmental resilience in the face of climate threats. We anticipate that successful proposals will also then require partnerships between farmer-facing organizations and research organizations. I want to note that the crops and the geographies listed in the request for applications are specific to PepsiCo sourcing regions, so proposals outside of those regions or crop systems will be considered non-responsive. If you have questions about a specific crop or region, please feel free to ask today or reach out to me. I'm happy to provide feedback. While we want projects to focus on implementation and on working with farmers to implement practices and study those impacts, we also recognize that identifying climate impacts on a crop in a region in the future, determining appropriate adaptation responses, can be a whole field of research and a research project in and of itself. We are encouraging applicants to identify existing sources of information on climate impact studies from literature, from other resources out there facilitating adaptation and resilience. We want the bulk of the funding from this opportunity to be used on that implementation and the associated research. To that end, we're providing access to a resource that's been developed by the CGIAR Center CIAT that synthesizes climate impact information and simulates potential impact of specific adaptation responses. This is a resource that will be made available to all applicants when they are invited to submit a full proposal. It's not required that you use this resource. If you have access to other sources of information on climate impacts and adaptation, that can certainly be used instead. But we recognize that it's not that information is not readily available globally. So we want to give everybody the opportunity to have access to this information from a credible scientific source. With that, the focus of today's webinar is to provide that background information on the climate impacts tool. And there will be a demonstration of the resource so that you all can factor availability of this into pre-proposal submissions. To that end, I'm joined here by Tiffany Talsma, who's a climate strategy specialist at CIAT, who's been leading this research, and she'll provide the demonstration. And there will be opportunity for questions after. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Tiffany.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Allison. Just want to remind everyone, please don't hold your questions to the end. Feel free to drop them into the Q&A box as we go, just to keep them fresh and relevant to the material, and we can go back over any material that might be of interest at the end. So just a quick word of introduction. The Alliance of Bioversity and CIAT are two CGIAR research centers that are working on environmental and climate relationships with agriculture around the world, including in tropical countries and in temperate countries as well. This partnership that we have ongoing with PepsiCo has spanned nearly 3 years now, where we've been working in collaboration with them to make climate science and future projections more relevant to decision makers. So this is really a product of that partnership, where they have challenged our thinking on how to make science more accessible. And we've hopefully created a tool that can be very useful in terms of thinking in the next 5 to 10 years about what climate smart agricultural practices will be the biggest priority to promote for these specific crops and these specific regions. So we'll go over a quick introduction on the purpose of this tool that we're presenting today, and then how to use it. The climate resilience work has 3 main purposes. One is to identify what is the nature of the climate risk. So not just generic climate change. We know temperatures are rising, but in different areas for different crops, the risk that is going to be the limiting factor, limiting productivity, might be different. So we look in this specific product at heat, at flood, which is extreme precipitation during critical periods of growth. We look at frost risk, which in general is going down, and we look at drought. And drought in this context is heat plus evapotranspiration. So we're looking at lack of precipitation and heat in combination. So that's an SPEI index for those who want to look up more details on how that drought risk is calculated. We're also focused then on positioning adaptation as an opportunity. So much of the work on climate smart agriculture practices, regenerative agriculture practices, it's no longer a CSR plug, but really looking at how do we secure agriculture productivity into the future in the face of climate change. So how do we start to make that connection more relevant and more visible? And we also have the purpose of quantifying the risk and the opportunity to the business. So what is the actual return on that investment today in climate smart agriculture with regard to risk reduction in the future? So with those objectives in mind, we focused this tool on decision-making uses that can help to factor climate change into planning processes, mostly long-term planning processes of 3 years or more, to help make the business case for climate smart agriculture practice and investment that requires, and to help also target the climate smart agriculture practices based on the specific place and season in which that crop is grown. So we have a lot of maps as well as other data visualizations that can be explored to help understand where those practices are. In scope overall are 8 crops in more than 50 countries. This is all going to be available within the tool. But today we'll focus on the examples from the crops and regions that are specified in the RFA. So we're talking about North America, South Africa, Australia, and the crops that are represented there. But when you do get access to the tool later, there will be other geographies due to the scope of work with PepsiCo. So how do we use that? So far, I only see 2 questions, so I'm hoping that means that this is very clear, but please feel free to drop them in the chat. So the tool is available online. All of the data was processed, pre-processed offline, and then loaded into various layers, which can be turned on and off through interaction controls in the website. What we're looking at here is change into 2030 as compared to a baseline period. So we take baseline climate of 1993 to 2016 as kind of our reference climate of how we know the crop in question to be produced. We look at the climate projections for 2030, which is more of a range from 2030 to 2040, the expected climate across those variables, and the degree of change that is expected between those, that delta between those 2 periods. Where that degree of change exceeds certain thresholds that particular crop is sensitive to. So in this case, oats. Number of days over, for example, 28 degrees would be a huge threat to oats, because that is, those would count as their killing days, essentially, the days over which the crop functioning is severely compromised. And as we see in this example for Mexico, this is oats in Mexico, heat stress is the major limiting factor in more than 90% of the producing areas in Mexico going forward. And we can see the distribution across all of the different impact zones. So for the areas in Mexico where oats are produced, we only see a very small fraction that will experience a moderate yield gain due to reduced frost risk. And the orange and the red slices of the pie indicate risk of high and extremely high yield loss risk, due mostly to the effect of that increased heat stress. That's change above and beyond the stress that they might already be in today. So in the case of oats in Mexico, it's really a question of what adaptation practices can be taken into account to survive or otherwise switch to other crops that are more relevant. So this is just one example. In contrast, we see oats in the United States looking also like there are quite some stress zones, but much more favorable in some areas with no change. And the areas of green, we see potential yield gain due predominantly to reduced frost risk, which extends the growing period and reduces risk of losses due to earlier frost. So these examples are available also for Australia and South Africa across all of the crops. The interface allows you to click on the global map, enter a crop. Once you get into the crop view, enter a country. Once you get into the country view, select a crop from this menu and see what the risk is there. In this right-hand column, you'll see the number of acres that are produced in that country. And that feeds into this breakdown of the risk by risk category. It can also be used to identify areas for expansion. So in this example of canola in the United States, we see quite some yield gain opportunities in many of the areas in the north and the west of the country. Those may not be areas where canola is currently grown or is only grown in small quantities. And so this is also a means to find opportunity crops, for example, for crop rotation that may be able to replace current crop rotation that is not as viable. Let me just skip ahead a little bit. I think that's enough examples of how it can be used on the crop country rotation. We have a lot of screenshots of how it all looks. One feature which is being built right now and is not available on the website yet, but will be available in February before you need to use it, is related to which limiting factor is present where. So on the right, there's the menu with the heat stress, the frost risk, the flood, and the drought. And if that is selected, then the relevant limiting factor is displayed so you can see where a particular limiting factor is the one at play. And another feature is a simulation of what the adaptation practices or the climate smart practices could achieve in a future scenario where all of those practices are adopted. So that's under this resilient pathway tab. A number of practices will be preloaded. These are practices that we have sourced either through expert interview, literature review, predominantly those two sources, so mostly from the literature, and in cases where there was very little literature supplemented with subject matter expert interviews on which practices respond to which risks in each area. Those practices have been sorted by, categorized by type and sorted by risk mitigation potential based on the risk that they are able to respond to. And they're also given a Regen Ag score, and that links to the PepsiCo's PepsiCo Positive strategy on promoting use of Regen Ag across their acres that they source from. So this Regen Ag score aligns to the PepsiCo Positive strategy, and a higher score means it covers multiple impact areas. So this simulation shows, in the case that all of these adaptation practices are put in place, and given the risk from where we were starting, what would be the potential future resilient scenario by 2030 if all of the producing areas were to put all of those practices in place. So it's a bit of a visualization tool to show which risks can actually be adapted for and which ones would still remain even with those practices in place. So let me stop there and open it up for questions, and then we can dig into any of these slides in more detail as questions arise. I'll stop screen sharing for now.
Thank you, Tiffany. There are a number of questions specific to different features of the tool. So for everyone listening as well, the presentation today is in large part because the information for all of the regions and crops is still being processed. So it will be available by the time of the applications are invited in March. But we don't have the link right now for everyone to start digging in and playing with it. So. But with that, we have questions in various formats here. Tiffany, I don't know if you can see.
I can see both
the Q&A.
chat
Okay.
and Q&A box. Which one do we want to start with?
So let's do the chat really quickly. Let's see, looking at the map for oats in Mexico, does the analysis take into account the intensity and frequency of the oat production in the area?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The map is showing the entire political jurisdiction. So it shows a color regardless of whether or not there's production there. The pie charts that are below that show the impact area, the breakdown of the impact area, does take into account the production area. What we don't have for that production area is the productivity of each acre, but we know the number of acres where oats are produced. We have total volume, but then we don't have tons per acre at each of the specific sites. So I think someone else had a question on the source of that data. That's from the Ramakuti lab. So there was a global assessment of all available data on crop production using NDVI, remote sensing, and also national statistics. And this global database has been made publicly available. It's sometimes also referred to as the Monfreda et al. Data set. So that's the source that we're using for those production areas. And maybe just to clarify, those are not necessarily the production areas. It's much larger than the production areas where PepsiCo themselves are sourcing. So PepsiCo may only be buying from a subset of that, but that covers all of the global production areas of where that particular crop is produced.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question, and if not, I guess just drop another question in the chat or Q&A box.
Yes, and folks can also raise their hand, and we can unmute people to ask questions directly if you would like that. We also have Andre Painter here who can join us in answering some of the questions relative to the scope of the RFA. There were a couple questions, I think, about the list of practices and things included, including one about is there a reason crop protection isn't included there? I would say that crop protection is considered a resilience, building practice and adaptation practice, certainly, but I don't know the extent to which you want to address that, Tiffany.
Yeah, it didn't appear on the list because we only had those 4 sample practices, but crop protection is definitely included.
Okay. I think there was another question of just, can we see a full list of the practices that are available for different crops and regions in the tool so that people can see that information? Is that a resource that could be provided? If we can share that
Yes,
through FAR's
I
website.
think, I mean, the way it will be specific to the crop in each country because the practices are matched based on the risk. So there's not one global data set of all of those, but for each country and crop, then there would be the full list of the practices. And to the extent possible, those are linked then back to the PepsiCo Regen Ag practices, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're totally exclusive. I think others may have other practices or more specific practices to contribute.
Yes.
So they are a little bit more generic to be more inclusive.
Yes. So we can make accessible some information on the FAR website about the specific practices that are included in the tool. But again, that's not restrictive, right? You are free to look at additional practices that you think meet the resiliency adaptation needs, and to be more specific than the practices that are in this tool. This is just a baseline resource for everyone to have. Let's see. Sorry, there's a lot of questions in here I'm trying to get. Yes, let's use the Q&A. It'll be a little easier to address. Okay. For a specific region, how did you collect the data? For example, I did not see rice in the USA projection. Do you have a map for that crop?
Rice is not one of the crops in scope, so we haven't looked at it at all. And I think on the data collection, at least for production areas, that was the earlier response. And on climate data, we're also using globally available global circulation models that project future climate. So there are some products which bring 33 different models together, and that is what we're using as the future climate projection for 2030 to 2040.
There's another question here. Is 2030 the only future climate scenario, or are there other future dates offered?
Good question. It's the only one offered.
We're looking for the near-term impact in this particular opportunity. There's one question I can answer. Does your proposed strategy need to be one of those adaptation strategies included in the software? No, you can include different adaptation options. This is just a baseline resource that we're making available. But if you have something that's not included here and you elect to use a different source of information for understanding impacts and adaptation, that's perfectly fine. I've addressed the link. Is the map an open API? So I think there's several questions about access. So just to address those again, right now this tool is still, the tool has been developed for some crops and regions, but it's not publicly available at this time because they are still processing the information for all of the regions that we're focused on and all of the scenarios we're focused on in this RFA. So it will be made available early to those folks who are selected to submit a full proposal. So at that point, it will be made available to those folks. It will be made publicly available later down the line. It will become a public resource, but we does need to go through additional peer review and analysis before then, but we are making this information available to applicants at that time. Another question, could you please comment on the maturity of the technology in the proposal? Should it be ready for deployment? Yes, we are expecting this to be implementation on working farms rather than additional field trials or proving the technology, but these should be proven practices, evaluating both their regenerative agricultural properties as well as their ability to help farmers adapt and build resilience. but it should not be technology development or field trials within this project. A question about the tool here. It looks like counties in the US that have high yield loss predicted are somewhat urban counties. Looking at North Dakota specifically, does this tool take expansion of urban areas into account?
That's a good question. No, not at all. It only takes climate into account. So expansion of urban areas, soil suitability, any other topographical information is not taken into account. The production areas data, which it's difficult to see currently, but there's an overlay of where the production of that crop is. So I think we need to work on our visualizations of that, and that will be ready for the shortlisted applicants. So you'll be able to see where the crop is currently grown, which should be a pretty good indication of soil and urban and those other factors, and help to exclude the areas that might not be suitable for non-climate factors. But the colors that are shown on the map right now only take climate variables into account.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question about, are proposed projects better if they're in a single geographic area, or are comparisons encouraged? So I think we're open to either. You do not have to compare regions. We do obviously anticipate there's collaboration with farmers in a region, so that might speak to more local projects specific to one region. The question here asks about comparing, dry lands, for example, between a couple of the regions. That would also be a potential response. So we would certainly welcome proposals as well if they want to look in two different regions, but they do still need to have that connection with the farmers in those specific regions. So that might be a larger partnership with additional partner members, but that is certainly encouraged. Okay, so there's some requests. We can provide the slides and some additional information on the tool up on our website as well. I think there's a request just for an overview document, which we can certainly provide. Sorry, I'm just reading through the questions. Several just about the project. So one is about the ideal duration of the project. I believe we've said these are up to 3 years. We anticipate they would need to be multi-year projects, but we're hoping to have them be in that 3-year range. Let's see, are intercropping or alley cropping adaptation strategies that could be used? Yes, I would say those are strategies that could be used. Do proposals need to be focused on using this tool with stakeholders? No, this is a tool that we anticipate would be used by the research team, communicating with the stakeholders or participants in the project who are farmers or other stakeholders, could certainly use some information from this, but it's certainly not required or necessary. Let's see. Looking for the ones that are specific to your tool here. There's a question about to what extent proposals should prioritize climate change adaptation versus mitigation. So our definition of climate smart practices is practices that actually facilitate both mitigation or reducing emissions as well as adaptation. For this project, we are focused on building resilience. So adaptation practices that build that resilience. However, we do want applicants to have a plan for estimating any greenhouse gas impacts of those practices. It does not have to include a direct measurement, but we do want to see that there's attention being paid to greenhouse gas implications of any of the practices or the soil carbon implications of the practices being adopted here. Genetic improvement, there are a couple questions about that. So in terms of, like, for example, field trials of new crops and things like that is largely out of scope for this. We're really looking for those agronomic practices that count as regenerative. For people who have a lot of other ideas, in particular on the crop breeding side, I will mention that we do have other programs at FAR, and just yesterday a separate solicitation was opened called Seeding Solutions that has a much broader scope. So for folks who are really interested in FAR opportunities, I encourage you to take a look at that as well, because it is much broader of an opportunity. This is than the one we're discussing here today. Let's see. I might call on Andre. Is Mexico one of the countries? We do say North America.
Mexico is an important market for us, so I think we could include it, yes.
Okay, thank you. So the folks who would love to collaborate and co-apply, we do encourage collaborations and partnerships in this. We're not in a position to facilitate developing those partnerships, so that's on the applicants to identify the partnerships that will work. We are looking for research that is understanding, what we want to do is both implement these practices with farmers and understand how those practices are impacting the farmer's ability to be resilient to climate stresses and to have, with that being both economic and environmental resilience. So environmental resilience being around productivity and other environmental outcomes. So we're really looking at that research on the implementation of the practices with farmers, rather than, again, technology development of new technologies with this. Will farmers that participate become ineligible for carbon offsets or credits? I think that is not something I can address. That's going to depend on the various rules for different carbon offsets and credit programs. So I think that would be up to each individual project to evaluate. Let's see. We are getting a couple of hands up as well. I can't see those, Olivia. I don't know if there's anyone you can call on to ask a question live.
Yes, I will go ahead and call on Vahid, I believe. So let's see. Okay. Vahid, if
Hi, sorry. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Does the proposal accept, does the RFA accept proposal related to socio-economic impact on climate resiliency, like BMP adaptation, evaluating transformative ability of farmers?
Yes, so socioeconomic research, yes, on the implementation. It would need to include the adoption of those practices, but yes, that type of research is in scope.
Thank you.
Great. Next, we have another question, hand up from Natalie. So I'll go ahead and. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, this is Natalie at University of Chicago. Thank you so much for this presentation. I see that you have a recent 2022 grant that was awarded to Ohio State University. And I'm wondering if this is a good example of a type of project that you are seeking to continue, that you're looking for more data inputs for the tool you've created. That's my understanding of a large purpose for this particular call. Would that be inaccurate?
We're not looking for projects to add information to this tool, no, and that Ohio State University project is specific to research on soil carbon sequestration as a climate solution. It's a very broad research study. So I would say we're looking for something a little bit different with this one. We are interested, again, in that climate resiliency, focused on one of the motivations here, I would say, is, as PepsiCo and other companies are looking out into the future and looking at their regenerative agriculture programs, one of the goals for their regenerative agriculture programs is that their sourcing regions, the farmers they source and source their supplies from and so on, will continue to be able to produce that crop into the future, right? And so it's really looking at where are the investments to be made in regenerative agriculture adoption by farmers, where is that going to, what practices and what regions can really be effective in promoting that resiliency to ensure a future food supply. So I would say this project is really more oriented towards that than the specific study. The research that's being done in the Ohio State study is more looking at gathering data on, soil carbon sequestration potential on working farms and things like that. So the scope is a little bit different. The research, again, it's not oriented towards replicating the things that are in the tool that Tiffany was presenting. That tool will be a resource that's available to applicants. Hope that helps, Natalie.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe Alison, I could also add a bit of context, because I saw a question earlier that was really good, is what does good look like? And for PepsiCo, I think you put it really nicely. For us, it's about how do we keep farmers farming in the future of climate change? And what we found is that communicating about 2050 and 2080 impacts really doesn't feel close enough to home for people to make change that is needed now, which is one of the reasons why they decided to look at 2030. Even that feels like a lifetime away for a lot of people. Hence the work with SEAD. So we really want to make sure that we are connecting the dots between our positive ag agenda and the broader regen ag developments in the food and beverage sector to addressing climate change impacts that we can't do anything about anymore, other than adapting to them. So what we're interested in is the question, how do we help, or how do we create research and a broader understanding across the industry of how to accelerate the right regen ag practices within critical stakeholder groups, such as farmers? What are those moments when farmers decide, okay, I want to try something new. I want to try cover crop. I'm going to give this a shot, and I'm going to scale this up now. So that's kind of where we are trying to position this research from our side, is really can, on the one hand, really drive impact in key geographies and key crops for us with our partners and beyond. And I think that's the beyond piece is the critical bit, where we really want to make sure that this is not just the PepsiCo initiative, but that the entire food system moves towards more effective, more fast-paced adoption of regen ag practices. And I hope that this research can really help accelerate this understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andre. We have a couple more hands raised, so
Okay.
go ahead and move forward with that. Chris, going to, if you're there, go ahead, Chris.
Thank you very much. My compliments to the team on this really interesting and necessary research project. It's fantastic, and even if we don't participate, I will be watching this with a lot of interest and support. My question was, I think, partially answered, and there may not be an answer at this point in time, but it really is about, how farmers that participate in this research, if there's any forms of things that they need to know about that they will no longer be able to do or participate in. So a great example is carbon credits, offsets, whether it be through voluntary or compliance markets, because right now there are programs out there that are incenting farmers to implement beneficial management practices, but they're not allowed to participate in carbon credit programs. So I don't necessarily disagree with it's up to the voluntary carbon markets and the registries to make that determination, but I think PepsiCo and others would probably want to think about that. If more farmers can participate in it and do carbon credits and generate a new cash crop, even better. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you for that comment. Carbon credits not a specific focus here, but obviously there is a lot of work ongoing in that space at the moment.
Yeah, maybe if I could add a sentence here,
Sure.
Alison. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Great question. The carbon markets are a bit of a wild west at the moment again. So I think what we as PepsiCo are interested in is how do we help, as you said, how do we incentivize the right impacts with farmers, the right environmental impacts? Carbon credits, I think we need to see how the FLAC target is developing, what they allow, what they don't allow. I don't think, we are not really in the business of buying carbon credits. We're much more interested in kind of working with our supply chain partners, and that starts with the farmer, to work together to add value to everybody in the supply chain and incentivize the right practices in the field.
Great. We have one more hand raised, and then Allison, I'll hand it back to you for the Q&A. So Srinivasa, if you're there, I'm going to.
Yeah,
Still on mute, I think.
yeah, thanks. It's a nice explanation. My question has already been answered by Ellison. There has been budget allocated for as a kind of incentive to the adopters. Thanks.
Yes. We anticipate that there will potentially be need to support growers in adopting the practices. So that's can be included in the budget. All right. Thank you, Olivia, for managing that. Let's see. I think there's a request for links to the Seeding Solutions opportunity that's available from the FAR website. Maybe Olivia or Rachel can pop that into the chat real quick. There are some folks who are using the chat now to identify partners. So if you want to throw your name out there and your email, that's perfectly fine. Again, we're not in a position to do that matchmaking, but we certainly encourage organizations to partner with one another on this opportunity. I'm not sure if I'm missing any particular specific questions here. We've addressed at providing some more information on the tool itself.
There's a question from Joshua Zuckerman. I think it's a good one, and maybe it requires a bit of teamwork to answer.
Okay.
Can you explain more of the agricultural score that was mentioned earlier? Is this to be used for M&E purposes? So I think that was related to the adaptation, if I'm not wrong. And under the adaptation practices that are provided under the Climate Resilient Pathway tab, those practices have been marked with what we're calling a Regen Ag score. The Regen Ag score is really related to the PepsiCo Positive strategy. And that's calculated based on the degree, how direct the impact is. So whether it's direct, indirect, or no impact across 5 different impact areas on the benefits to soil, the benefits to water, the benefits to biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and livelihoods. So by weighting the intensity of the impact across those factors, there's a score. I mean, it's nothing nothing to overcomplicate, but rather to just say how many impact areas and how directly does this practice relate to the PepsiCo Positive score. Whether or not that's to be used for monitoring and evaluation purposes, I'll maybe hand over to Allison and Andre to answer that one.
Any thoughts from you, Andre, on that?
Yeah, so thanks, Tiffany. So I think what we want to do is as Tiffany said, we want to link this up to our understanding of Regen Ag and the outcome areas that we want to influence: biodiversity, watershed health, climate resilience, soil health, livelihoods. So all of the practices that Tiffany mapped out were mapped out against our so-called practice bank and how they map into these different impact areas. All of this is, by the way, online. You can go on PepsiCo.com, look for our supplier, Positive Ag supplier playbook. It's all in there, everything that how we think about Positive Ag. So if you want to study that, that might be also quite interesting for you. And we're influencing we're trying to help the industry come to a more aligned understanding of what Regen Ag means and how do we count it. So I think for us, it'll be important to communicate it back to our business, how we're influencing improvement against these impact areas.
Yeah, and just, I think there've been a few questions kind of about how this works. We didn't provide too much of an introduction to FAR at the beginning, but of course, we support research that is where matching funds are provided by non-federal funding partners. So FAR had federal government money in the US that we redirect toward agricultural and food research with private sector partners of a variety of stripes. This particular opportunity is co-funded with PepsiCo. They are putting up the matching funds, which is why we're focusing on the crops and regions that they are most interested in for their sustainable sourcing. And that's why this has that component of the regenerative agriculture. I would say that it's not restrictive only to that definition of regenerative or only to the practices in the tool. It is specific to the crops and regions, but we are looking for folks who are in these regions, who are experts in the science of climate impacts and adaptation, who are experts working with farmers in these regions to also identify what they see as the greatest opportunity and the greatest need for building resilience in those communities. So, yes, these resources exist. But if you know your community and you know what there's something you really think is important to study and understand, if these are practices that can benefit farmers in terms of building resiliency and building their economic resiliency and ability to continue to produce food under a changing climate, then we do encourage folks to identify those options as well. That could be through your own research. Again, we're not limited to what's in the tool. It can be from other research or literature sources as well. So I just wanted to address that.
Fully agree, Alison. It's a living document that we created, and hopefully we can add some more.
Yes. Great. Like everybody's and there's some questions here about things like, to what extent can it be on-farm trials? I mean, yes, we want what we're not specifically looking for is just a technical on-farm trial of compare and contrast of different practices against one another necessarily in a structured on-farm trial of a new technology to prove a particular technology's or a trait's success, for example. It's not necessarily what we're looking at. We're more interested in taking technologies that are relatively well known and ready for implementation and getting those adopted over larger areas. So there is this implementation component. We will be looking for proposals that have the potential to scale. There was an earlier question about number of farms, right? That could be quite variable depending on where you are. But we do want to look for solutions that could scale and for projects where you might be working with a small group of producers within the project, but you identify that it's very relevant for a larger region and it's something that has the potential to scale to more producers outside of that project. So those are, that is also a feature that we're looking for, which is why I'm saying things like not just on-farm trials or new technologies, is because we do want to get to that idea of what are some of the things that are ready to scale with this.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Alison. And there was this question earlier: does socioeconomic research feature? Very heavily so, because I think we'll be looking at the theory of change, how we can drive well-known practices across a broader farm base. So things like demonstration farms that are really not research plots, but really active engagement with the local farmer community. We're interested in creating farmer-to-farmer learning networks. So really understanding how farmers influence each other, how farmers learn from each other, how farmers influence each other to change practices and adopt new practices over time. This is the theory of change behind how we get to scale. It's something that we'll be really looking for. And thanks, Chris, for showing all the links.
Great. I have another attendee with their hand raised. So,
Okay.
David, if you are ready.
Hi, I'm David Rourke. I'm a 66-year-old farmer from Western Canada and also have run an ag research company for over 40 years at 5 locations. But our federal government has suggested that we do 3 things, and they've incentivized us in excess of $470 million to do rotational grazing, 4Rs, and particularly cover crops. And I'll just concentrate on cover crops. There's 78 million acres of Western Canadian grain land. It's the largest manageable sink that we have in probably Canada. But the biggest opportunity for cover crops is to sow them in the fall, immediately after combining. So that's like asking the farmers that farm 78 million acres to seed all their land a second time, but this time do it while they're combining, and take $30 to $50 out of their pocket and hope someday in the future that they'll get a return. And to put that in context, the net average profit for farmers in Western Canada is $50 an acre. So that's like gambling their whole income on something that they may get in the future. So it's not a solution. And further to that, my wife suggests if I get off the combine and think I should go and seed, that I must have seasonal seeding disorder. And she suggests a few different treatments that she might apply so that would cure me of that tendency, I guess. So we need some really innovative research and allow us to do that. And I'm suggesting that we need things like delayed seed germination, so we can either genetically or with coatings allow our cover crops to be sown with our spring crops when we're already going over the field, but they don't germinate for say 80 days later. So that's what I consider research. And you use the word research, and I don't understand how you use that word if you're not allowing us to overcome the real hurdles that exist for regenerative agriculture and it's not just a Western Canadian problem. It's Great Plains, it's China, it's Russia, Ukraine, and they have other problems, obviously. But if we're all going to try to figure out how to get regen and cover crops and plants growing from snow to snow, we actually need some dollars in those really innovative solutions, because just as our federal government is doing, saying the word cover crops and throwing money at it isn't going to make the change.
Right. So I appreciate your question and your raising your hand and speaking out today. It's great to hear that. And I agree that there is a lot of research that is needed on all of these solutions, certainly. We have a relatively small opportunity here when you compare it to things like what is happening at the Canadian government or even the US government level, the amount of investment in the research in this area. So we're focusing in on this one specific topic for this particular RFA. As I mentioned earlier, there is another open opportunity with FAR, our Seeding Solutions opportunity for a much broader scope of research. We have other opportunities throughout the year. So there are many opportunities that we put out there. This one certainly projects that involve implementing practices with producers are going to need to explore what makes those most practical. And it might include determining the best timing for seeding, helping to figure out what the right value proposition or what the right financial incentive or mechanism is for making it something that actually works within a producer's operation. So we do want that collaboration between producers and researchers so that the researchers are asking the questions that are of the most practical importance to the farmers. So that's, I guess, one response there. I don't know, Andre, if you have anything else to add, or if we have other questions. And the Seeding Solutions opportunity has just been added into the chat. You're welcome to take a look at that. Anyone else is as well, and then see if there are other opportunities that FAR has that fit with everybody's research needs.
Yeah, maybe just really quick, David, really appreciate your point. And I think it is actually those kind of innovations in the research that in conversations with farmers we come up against all the time. So we're not saying that this isn't the right kind of research at all. I think to Alison's point, in this case, we're kind of looking at research to scale existing practices. So if these, delayed seed germination, if this is science that is available but is not getting the right uptake, I think what we're interested in is like, how do we do that? How do we get it the right uptake? And how do we scale that? So really appreciate your work and your thinking around this. If this fits in, please, go ahead and apply and work on the RFA. But I think we are trying to, in this call, drive adoption of existing practices.
All right. I think we're slowing down with the chat a little bit. I think we've addressed a lot of questions. I see some folks dropping off as well. We do have 5 more minutes of time if there are any additional questions. I'm looking at if there's anything else you see here, Tiffany, that you would like to address. Again, we will post this webinar recording on our website. We will also post some basic background information on the tool that Tiffany mentioned. There were several requests for some of the data resources list, names of that, as well as the list of practices, regions, and crops. So we will make that available as well. Please give us a week or so to put that up. Hopefully this has been useful in clarifying the scope of this particular funding opportunity that we have open. Again, my email is available in the RFA, so please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions about any ideas that you have for the proposal. We're happy to address those as we're in this pre-proposal stage. Anything else? Anyone? All right. We're slowing down here. So thank you everyone for participating today. We really appreciate your interest, and we look forward to seeing the great ideas that we get in response to the solicitation. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Bye.